Our guest this week on Veterans Chronicles is Tom Fitzpatrick. He's a U.S. Army Air Corps veteran of World War II, in which he served on a B-17 bomber crew. And Tom, thank you very much for being with us.
Glad to be here.
Where were you born and raised, sir?
I was born in Springfield Township, Montgomery County in Pennsylvania in 1924.
Wow. Tell us about your family.
I had a sister who was 2 years older. My father had been a veteran of World War I, and he married right after he got out of the Army, and my sister was the firstborn in 1922, and I followed in 1924, and that was the extent of our family.
What was the impact of the Great Depression on your family?
We all had it pretty tough during the Depression. Right after the war, my father had a little meat and grocery store, and all of a sudden nobody could pay him. So we struggled along. He gave me a 16-gauge shotgun. I think I was about 12. He said, go out and put some meat on the table. And those days, there were plenty of pheasants and quail around, and we ate pretty good.
You were a good shot.
Yeah. But then, of course, when the war economy began, my father had been trained as a machinist, and he got a pretty good job with the Globe Hoist Elevator Company, and he made good money during the war years. So the Depression years, they were tough, but they weren't long, you know. So we did well.
You were 17 years old when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor.
Right.
How did you what was your reaction? How do you remember that day?
I was a soda jerk in a drugstore. It was a Sunday afternoon. We had a little radio up on the shelf, and I heard it, and I thought, sure enough, I'll be involved in this, you know, because I was in my senior year in high school at that time. But it was a bit of a shock. You know, we were still singing the songs of World War I, and even some of the Civil War songs. Couldn't believe we were going to be engaged in another conflict.
What was your father's reaction after serving in World War I?
He was pretty appalled. He saw action in France. He was in the artillery. 5th Trench Mortar Battalion, as I remember. And he was hoping I wouldn't have to go, but we still had the draft those days. And when I got out of high school, I was not quite old enough for the draft, but I began working for the Department of Agriculture in the Chemical Research Lab. And I worked there for 8 months, and I knew I'd be drafted, but they opened up the Air Corps. So I took the examination, and I was admitted to the Air Corps as an aviation cadet. And some pretty good training. We had infantry training in Keesler Field, Mississippi in the summer. That was a little harsh.
A little toasty.
But then we drove from the Mexican border to the Canadian border to Moorhead State Teachers College. And that's where we had aviation cadet academic training. And I learned to fly at Fargo Airport. Was right across the river from Moorhead, was Fargo, North Dakota.
Had you ever flown before you joined the service?
No, I didn't even have a driver's license. I was 18 years old.
Had you ever been on a plane?
No.
No?
They weren't that prevalent those days.
That's true.
In fact, you know, if we saw one, we'd call out the neighbors and to see this airplane. I actually met one of the Wright brothers. I met Orville Wright. You know, he lived to be, he died in 1947. So I met him while I was in the service. So it was a great experience. I enjoyed flying, but I didn't make pilot.
What was it like the first time you got in the air? What was that feeling like?
Great, great.
Is it exhilarating?
I think I'm a pretty good knack for it. I got good marks from the instructor and all. But we had to do all the acrobatics, spins and stalls and everything else. I wasn't too happy with that, but it was kind of fun. When you're 18, that's kind of fun.
So they didn't make you a pilot, but they did make you a radio navigator. How'd you feel about that?
Well, I think I fitted in there properly in the crew. Looking back, I was a little chagrined. One of the things, there's 4 big throttles in a B-17, and my hand wasn't big enough to handle anything like that. But there were other reasons, and I didn't want to be a bombardier, so I opted to be a radio operator. I didn't get a commission, but that didn't bother me very much. I had more knowledge of what was going on than the pilot, because actually I was in contact with wing headquarters and, all over the globe. And I think one of the greatest things I ever did, we went to Newfoundland, and we were getting ready to go to Europe. We were snowed in there for a while, and finally we got the tailwind to go. And the celestial navigator had been drinking all night long, and he was not fit to take that bomber across the ocean. So I had at 20 years of old, maybe 19 years, I was about 19. I navigated that bomber from Newfoundland to the Azores, and mostly with the radio compass and triangulation. I called Iceland, and so it was, I had the responsibility of 10 men, and the ship we flew over was called a Mickey ship. It was a new invention. There was a separate radio transmitter on it. When the Germans would pick up your altitude and everything in preparation of shooting you down, this radio transmitter would superimpose the transmitter on their transmitter and block it off. And this thing had 3 different transmitters. It could move from one to the other. And we were flying this ship. We didn't use this ship when we got over there, but it was our responsibility to get it there. But I always felt pretty good about that. I don't know whether I could do it today or not.
Tell our listeners a little bit more about what the role of the radio navigator is on a bombing mission.
Radio silence, pretty much. No, you keep listening all the time. And another thing that I felt pretty good about, we had just dropped our bombs, I forget the target, but you're constantly listening to transmission of other bombers, and I had a very faint signal from a crew that was going down over Yugoslavia. He was transmitting into clear, not in code. He said, going down over Yugo, and he gave us coordinates, latitude and longitude. And as soon as we got back, we debriefed. I gave that information to the debriefing officer, and they immediately flashed it into wing headquarters, and from there to the partisans in Yugoslavia. So they could get to that particular position before the Germans got there. I don't know whether they did or not, but it was a good shot, a good try.
Yeah, that's an amazing network that they had they had set up. So where were you based first, once you got to Europe?
We didn't move around. We hop-skipped across North Africa. We landed at the French Foreign Legion base for overnight, and they were pretty tough birds. Their war cry was "Vive les morts, vive la guerre, vive la Légion et ton cher." Vive la death, vive la for war, vive la French Foreign Legion. And I think we ate horse meat and camel meat while we were there. But then we flew over to across North Africa, and we jumped from North Africa up to southern Italy. The first day, we landed at a town called Gioia, because the bombers at the base where we're going to be permanent. They were coming back from a mission, so we had to wait until they all landed, and then we flew from Gioia up to Manfredonia, Foggia, where we were based. The air base that we used had been used in World War I by the Italians. They had the only bomber in World War I. And we flew Americans over there to fly those bombers. And one of them was Fiorello LaGuardia. He was the captain, and of course I'm sure he was bilingual. But they flew those old bombers over the Alps and bombed Germany. And of course, when he came back, he became mayor of New York, and LaGuardia Field was named after him.
Right.
But we used the same airstrip as they used in World War I. That was it was about 9 miles from Foggia, which was a sizable city. We found out that Santa Claus is buried there, St. Nicholas. There's a big iron fence around him because the Norwegians have been trying to steal him for years.
Mr. Fitzpatrick, tell us about the rest of your crew. Tell us about those men.
Well, we had a great pilot. He was only 24, but he was very mature, and he looked very mature for his age. His name was Clifford Foose. And he brought us home when I don't think any other pilot could do it, after being shot up, and all that sort of thing. Our navigator was Malcolm Sharp, and he was quite a ladies' man, I know that. He got in trouble wherever we went. The co-pilot, I can't come up with his name, but he was a Southern boy, and he knew his job pretty well. And the bombardier, they acted as what they called a toggelier. The lead plane dropped its bombs. The bombardier toggled his bombs at the same time. He didn't use his bomb sight. It was only the lead bombardier used the bomb sight. So I think we did a pretty good job of bombing. Our target was oil. And of course, we went to Ploesti. They said if you didn't have religion before you went to Ploesti, you had it afterwards. But we had a ball turret gunner. He was the only one got hit. It was Joe Martin. And I was in contact with him right up till the end. He passed away about a year ago. He lived in Fort Worth, Texas. He got hit in the left hip. And I got him out of the ball, and he always claimed I saved his life, but I don't think so. He lived, but he didn't fly after that. He had a big piece of flak came through the bottom of the ball turret and embedded itself in his hip. And we had a upper turret gunner. Some of these names are fading into oblivion now.
That's okay.
And a right and left waist gunner and a tail gunner. The tail gunner was Emsley, I remember that, because he was the oldest man on the crew. And during the winter over Germany that year, it was 60 below zero. And many tail gunners froze to death, actually, in those bombers. So we had to try and take good care of Emsley, and so we all made it back except for Joe Martin. And that's about it, I guess, as far as crew members go.
What was that first mission like?
We were anticipating, a real battle, but it was actually what we call a milk run. I think they deliberately do those sorts of things so you get your feet wet without being too scared. It was at a town called Castelfranco, a railroad yard, and we dropped their bombs. We had a little flak, but no fighter cover at all. So That was a pretty easy one. They got tougher after that.
Well, let's talk about that, because I know that you have received 5 bronze battle stars.
Right.
So let's talk about those as best as you can remember them. What happened on those missions?
Well, as I say, we were after oil constantly, and we always bombed a military target. We never bombed any civilian areas, except once, and I can tell you about that later. But and of course, as the Germans drew back, and the perimeter became shorter and shorter, so they accumulated more anti-aircraft guns, and the targets got a lot more difficult from anti-aircraft fire. And because we were bombing their source of gasoline, they couldn't put their aircraft in the sky. So we did not have a big problem with fighter planes. We had a few, and I think I got credit for a half or something like that. But when you have 11 machine guns on a bomber, and you have 7 bombers stacked up into a squadron, the Germans are quite fearful about flying through there, because those machine guns shot 8 rounds per second. And so we didn't have a lot of difficulty with the fighters, but we did with the flak. We always come home with 100 holes in the bomber. And, our worst mission, I guess, was when number 1 engine, one on the far left, a piece of flak cut the drive shaft of that engine. And it was windmilling, and we couldn't feather the engine. And because of the rapid windmilling, it was really shaking the bomber terribly, and then it went on fire. And we were well over Germany at that time. The pilot rang the bailout bell, and there's CO2 bottles between all the engines. The co-pilot pulled the first CO2 bottle and didn't put the fire out. So we had to take jump positions, fasten on our chutes. We were ready to go down into Germany. He pulled the second CO2 bottle, and the fire went out. And then number 4 engine quit, but we had 2 center engines, and we were able to get back over the Alps. You need 18,000 feet to get over the Alps, and then you coast home. But the pilot got the Distinguished Flying Cross for that mission, for bringing us all home safely. He had to do some tricky flying with that. But it became routine. We'd knock these oil refineries out. And the Germans had one oil refinery for synthetic oil at Wiener Neustadt. And we'd knock it out, and a week later, we'd be back on stream again. The Germans were very productive at that sort of thing. But we always, we hit a lot of anti-aircraft fire, and we lost a lot of planes. This is the Presidential Unit Citation, the blue. We got that for one mission when we lost the whole squadron. The 20th Squadron was completely knocked down. Fortunately, a lot of them became POWs, because I met them later at reunions, because we did get along well with the Luftwaffe. The common denominator is that we were all flyers, and they took care of us and we took care of them. If we got shot down and the SS didn't get you, but they got you, they called you Bruderlein, little brothers, take you in and give you a double schnapps. And we did the same. You know, they ate the same food we did. We had a little POW camp. And toward the end of the war, we left the gate open, and none of them left. They were going out into a world where they weren't going to get fed. But the missions were pretty much the same, one after the other. And actually, we hit southern France after D-Day. We went into Marseille. Very little resistance there, but we tried to draw troops down from, northern France. And the other one was for really the North African campaign, which I was not involved in. And that Bronze Star was for North African and Middle East. And third one was for the Battle of Foggia, where we finally ended up. We had a difficult time with the population there. That was a main hub, and of course the airstrip was being used by the enemy. And we dropped leaflets that we were going to bomb that area. But they had an aircraft shelter along the railroad tracks. But also along the railroad, they had these tank cars filled with naphtha or gasoline. And when we did finally bomb that railroad yard, we bombed the tank cars, and the fluids flew down into that air raid shelter, killing an awful lot of the population. So we were not too popular in the city of Foggia. You never went in by yourself, and you never went without your 45s. And we didn't go in often. But and then the final battle star was called the Battle of Rome. And that's when we used to fly up the Rhine River and get our targets in Northern Europe, the ones that the 8th Air Force didn't hit, and go all the way to Berlin. We only flew one mission to Berlin, and I took issue with it. It was 4 weeks before the end of the war. The Opel factory in Berlin was making tanks. And from southern Italy to Berlin was a 7-hour flight. And the 8th Air Force had practically leveled everything in Berlin by then. I think they wanted to get it on schedule or something that we bombed Berlin. But they flew that mission. I think we took 147 B-17s up there. And unfortunately, we lost 2 crews. And when I told them this at the Pentagon, they said, we would have more input today on scheduling such a mission. I said, well, we just did what we were told. But so they were making tanks in the Opel factory, but they didn't have any gasoline to run them. They didn't have any gasoline to fly their aircraft. So why spend a mission and losing 2 crews for a mission like that? So they did say they would have more input in the service today. But that was kind of the winding down of all my battle stars.
Sure. Well, one of the things that changed, of course, for the Air Corps in Europe was when they started having fighters escort the bomb groups. Did you have that the entire time that you were making bomb runs?
Right. We could only be escorted halfway to the target before the P-51. And the Krauts would wait until the fighters had to turn back for lack of fuel, and then they would hit you. But I say, we didn't have too much of a problem with fighters. Earlier in the war they did. But we hit the Me-262, the jet fighter. We hit that over Munich. And they could do a lot of damage, but luckily the war was winding down pretty much by the time they came along. But
so how did you evade when you got to the point before the P-51s that the fighters had to stop? How did you defend yourselves?
Well, they had formations you could fly to avoid, but primarily we were flying maybe with 1,000 bombers. and would stack them up, 7 to a group, 4 squadrons, 7 to a squadron, 4 squadrons to a group, and 8 squadrons to a wing, and 5 wings to an air force. And they were called the Flying Fortresses for nothing. So the fighters were, pretty much afraid, to go in through a group like that. So we didn't lose an awful lot, to the fighters. And then, of course, the P-51 came along. That could fly you all the way to the target. And it could fly at 450 miles an hour. And I recently came in contact with the Tuskegee Airmen. And they saved my life a couple of times over Germany. We had a bad turbo supercharger with an engine, and after the bomb drop, we'd fall behind the group. We're out there all by ourselves, and that's when the Messerschmitts would find you. But the Tuskegee Airmen were the red tails. They painted the tails of their planes red, and all of a sudden there'd be one of them on either wing, and they'd escort you all the way home. But just recently, I was invited to a contact with them, and 2 Sundays ago, we celebrated the 100th birthday of one of the same ones that saved my life, really. I have some pictures on my phone of them.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was a big event. There were about 600 or 800 people there. There was a country club, and we had a Marine Color Guard, and I had to take a bow because of being saved by the red tails. But they did a good job. They never lost the bomber. And the Germans, I think, were pretty much afraid of them.
Well, they made history, and
they did.
They collaborated with you as they made history.
They were based not far from us in Italy. We could see them. If they made a kill, they'd come in and do a barrel roll across their tarmac.
So when did you find out that the war was over in Europe? How did you find out?
Well, we knew it was winding down. Of course, the war in Europe was over before the war in Japan. And it came over the radio that it was over. And there were flares in every airplane to be used. Well, they gathered all these flares, and we had a hill behind the camp. They planted these flares in the hill, and they lit them all. Must have been 1,000 flares to celebrate, the victory. But it was interesting enough. Italy put the king back on the throne, Victor Emmanuel. And just about that time, I was up in Rome on R&R, and everybody was running up toward the Capo San Angelo. So we ran with the crowd, and I was standing on the curb, and this open car came by, and there was Victor Emmanuel and his son Umberto II. Well, he was about as close as from me to you. I put my hand out, and he put his hand out, and I shook hands with Umberto II. Now, that was in May. The 4th of July in Italy is the 2nd of June, and that's when they voted to do away with the monarchy and become a democracy. And the family went to Switzerland. Interestingly enough, my sister and I were in Portugal some years later, and the tour bus stopped along the coast road to look at some rock formation in the surf. And we get off the bus, and I'm looking on the other side of the road, and there's an estate, and a pillar was there with a little tag said Italia. And driving out that driveway at that minute was a convertible. And who was driving it? Umberto II. Talk about a coincidence, 2 times in a lifetime. Just at that minute that we were there, I recognized him immediately.
That is amazing.
It was.
For sure. Were you still in Europe when the war in the Pacific ended? Were you still in Europe when the war ended in the Pacific?
Yeah, they thought we might go to Korea. But I had enough points at that time to get out of the military. I had accumulated 96 points with my decorations and everything else. And I saw that free college education looming, so I got out. But it was a great adventure. I'm not a bit sorry it happened. I would do it again tomorrow. You had a front seat for the biggest show on earth, and you were, I was just a little homeboy before that, and I got to fly over half the world, and so I would go again tomorrow.
What did you do with that free education?
Well, I couldn't start from when I got out until the following autumn. And I went to Penn State. I got a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry. I was in the class of 1950, and I got the first class ring they ever had. They didn't have a class ring until 1950, and when they ordered these in, I was first in line, and when they opened the box, I got numero uno.
Oh, wow.
When I see kids around our neighborhood, I tell them that story. They're in awe of that.
The first one ever.
Then I went to the University of Maryland, and I did graduate work in microbiology. Got a master's degree in science there in 1953, I guess. In between, I went back to the government laboratory that I had started out in, before I went into service, and worked there summers. And it was a great part of the GI Bill. Your job had to be retained for you. And if a replacement had gotten any advancement, you accumulated that advancement when you came back. And a lady had gotten my job, but she had a degree, so she jumped a couple of grades, and I got her grades. But she married the boss, so everybody was happy, and she just passed away. But then I went back to the lab for quite a while, and I was kind of a guinea pig. I was able to do my research for my thesis at the government lab. They had to get permission from Congress for me to do this and to go to the university for the academic work. And so I essentially did all the academic work in 1 year for the doctorate. A little difficulty with the language requirements, particularly the German. I had to go back up a couple of times before I passed that. But I did a pretty good thesis, and they had a joint publication with the university and the federal government. So everybody was pretty happy about that. And I worked there then for the rest of my career. Retired when I was, in 1980 I retired. I was about 55, I had to be 55.
Well, sir, it's been an amazing story. We thank you so much for your service to our country. We thank you for your time with us today, and we hope you have a wonderful time at the parade today.
Well, thank you very kindly.
Thank you. Dr. Tom Fitzpatrick, U.S. Army Air Corps veteran of World War II, served as a radio navigator on a B-17 bomber crew based in Europe. I'm Greg Columbus. This is Veterans Chronicles.